she said to me, "Have you heard of hypnobirthing?" And I said, "No, what's that?" She suggested we would go in halves on buying this CD. She didn't have to do the full programme. A trained hypnotherapist can guide you through and deliver post-hypnotic suggestions. So not all therapy is equal. Talking therapies is many different styles. Counselling is great, but with counselling you have to be careful that you don't talk to the point that you're re-embedding the trauma. And that's how you pull something out by the root. A trauma is to use the rewind technique. It's one of many different techniques available, but it is particularly effective. Your brain, in a sense, doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's imagined, but you really need to be working on putting the past behind and resolving any traumas before you look at doing any coaching at all, because otherwise that dandelion, which if you just chop it off at its head, it's just going to keep growing back.
Today we're talking to a friend of mine, Rita Claire. She's a therapist, hypnotherapist and divorce coach. I just want to start off by asking, what is the difference between a therapist and a coach?
So a therapist, in my mind, if you're a solution-focused therapist, that is that you have three parts to the therapy. Is that you start by looking at the past, any traumas that the person needs to let go of, and then you've got the present, so looking at the here and now, looking at emotional needs, which I can talk about in a bit more detail, what's being met emotionally and what's not, and then looking at the future and sort of bridging that gap and finding solutions to get somebody from where they are now to where they want to be or how they want to be. And so not all therapy is equal, okay? Talking therapies is many different styles. Counselling is great, but with counselling you have to be careful that you don't talk to the point that you're re-embedding the trauma. And it's a bit like if you have a dandelion in the garden and you keep watering it and giving it space to really take root. That's what you're doing when you're constantly talking about your trauma and not actually finding ways to pull it out by the root and deal with it.
You've talked to me about the fact that you don't do what's commonly offered on the NHS, which is CBT. You do something else, which is Human Givens.
Human Givens therapy,
Yeah.
yes, and also the rewind technique. So, but that's dealing with trauma, and that's how you pull something out by the root. A trauma is to use the rewind technique. It's one of many different techniques available, but it is particularly effective and very quick. Quite similar to EMDR, but it can be done in 1 to 2 sessions, and I've used it with people who have returned from war zones. It's really effective. I just want to backtrack a little bit back because I haven't quite answered your first question.
Okay,
What's the
sure.
difference? But
Yeah.
I think I've got carried away. And so with coaching, we don't look at the past. Coaching technically assumes that you've already healed before you can look into your present and your future.
Okay, sure.
But of course, I'm both a coach, a life coach, Mind Valley certified life coach, divorce coach, and also a Human Givens therapist and hypnotherapist. So thankfully I can do all of those things. But you really need to be working on putting the past behind and resolving any traumas before you look at doing any coaching at all. Because otherwise that dandelion, which if you just chop it off at its head, it's just going to keep growing back.
So you sort of like, you can start at the beginning of the trauma and then afterwards help them with coaching afterwards.
Absolutely.
Therapy is always first, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So going to the therapy aspect of trauma, you mentioned the rewind technique. What's the rewind technique?
Great technique. It's actually based on an NLP technique, a neuro-linguistic programming.
Okay.
The rewind technique has been modified by the Human Givens Institute College, and so this is the training that we had. It's been modified to help people to get over trauma in as little as 1 session. And it's taking your trauma or whatever you want to let go of and visualizing it as a mini movie in your mind.
Okay.
And the great thing about this kind of therapy is you don't actually need to tell your therapist what the details of that trauma. So it helps to have some context, of course, but you don't need to re-embed it by talking about it a lot before you have this therapy. And so you have the beginning of the movie, and we obviously know the middle part, which is the traumatic part, and then we have the end part. So the beginning is where before everything became traumatic, and then everything at the end where everything calmed down again. So they're almost like the bookends to your traumatic movie, if you like. And the rewind helps you to almost compress that movie, so the bookends come together, and the traumatic part in the middle is compressed, and it's, I want to say, eradicated. Of course, it would be unethical to remove memories completely. You would still know it happened, but bizarrely, actually, this process helps you to stop being able to recall the details without really thinking hard about it.
And you say you can help a patient within literally one session?
Oh yes, I have helped people in one session. And a trauma can mean anything to anyone. It's whatever it means to you. So I'm not looking for the real definition of trauma, as a GP might tick a box. You might have to jump through several hoops and match the criteria to be deemed to have PTSD, for example. But, if you're someone who has been at school and you experienced a teacher say something horrible to you once, that can actually be really quite traumatic. And it might not be trauma in another person's books, but for you, that can stay with you for the rest of your life.
Have you heard of Gabor Mate?
Of course, yeah.
He said trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you.
Yes.
So anything could be traumatic, even on the surface, it doesn't look that traumatic to someone else.
Precisely, that's exactly it. And so I've helped people with all kinds of traumas, perceived traumas, that perhaps they haven't realised were traumas until I've pointed out they actually could be a kind of trauma for them. And so we've done this on, like I say, bullying at school, all the way through to, like I say, people returning from war zones.
Does your hypnotherapist background play into that, or is it just an aspect of NLP which you're using for it?
So I actually don't have to use hypnotherapy to do NLP, but of course with the rewind technique it's actually very useful to relax a person first. In fact, that is something you do need to do for the rewind to be effective, because essentially what you're doing is you're unhooking the emotion from that memory. And you can only do that from a place of calm. So I use hypnotherapy to get someone into a very relaxed state, to imagine being in their safe, relaxing place in their mind. Obviously, I help them to envisage what that might look like if they struggle. And then when they are very relaxed, that's when we do the rewind technique. So they're doing it very detached. They're viewing this movie as if it's happening to someone else. So it's like they're watching it as a third party, and they're able to take out the colour, take out the contrast, turn down the volume. So it becomes very grainy, like an old VHS cassette, perhaps, if you can imagine what that would be like if you've ever seen one. Not everyone has.
Yeah.
But when that's sort of fast forwarding and rewinding, it's quite difficult to see the images on the screen. So that's how I use the rewind technique.
I think I've heard of this before, but it was from a chap called Paul McKenna. I guess it's the same
kind
of principle.
So they call it different things. I've also heard it called the fast phobia cure.
Okay.
And the other names, technical names for it as well.
Okay, yeah. And you also mentioned EMDR. What's that?
So EMDR is not something I offer,
Okay.
But that's where you watch lights or dots going side to side. But if you think about it with the rewind, it's a very similar process. You're accessing those parts of the brain because when you're visualizing the rewind, I can actually see my client's eyes going backwards and forwards with their eyes closed. So it's still accessing the similar parts of the brain. I don't know too much about EMDR because, as I say, I'm not trained in it, but that's my understanding of how similar it actually is and how you can process memories.
Right, so let's just go into your background. How did you become a therapist?
Wow. So how I became a hypnotherapist, first of all, is quite interesting because it was back in 2009 and I was heavily pregnant, and I'd always had this fear of giving birth. I always thought I would never have a child because of it. And it was one day, a friend of mine who also was expecting, she said to me, "Have you heard of hypnobirthing?" And I said, "No, what's that?" And so she suggested we would go in halves on buying this CD. She didn't have to do the full program. And I listened to this CD religiously every single day for the last 2 to 3 months of my pregnancy. And what it did was it programmed my mind to be calm and to trust in my body. That is quite simply what it did. So that, in fact, when I did actually go into labour, I only had a 4-hour labour, what I would call labour, because labour means hard work, right?
Yeah.
So I actually only had 4 hours of hard work. And when I went into the hospital, the midwives were quite surprised how far along I was, because I wasn't distressed. I wasn't showing any signs of, real pain, because I had programmed my body to be completely relaxed through the process and really trust that my body knew what it was doing. So the birth went without any problems. And in fact, at one point I did actually have, there was a change of midwife, and this woman came in. I had a lovely lady before, and this woman came in and she was really stern, bright red lipstick, hair scraped back into a bun. She meant business. She was like a businesswoman. And I could feel everything, all that hard work I'd done started to just completely vanish, and I could feel myself tensing and getting really worked up, and then the pain started to intensify. Okay, so the contractions got worse, and I realised that this woman was causing this, and it was all in my mind. So I thought, no, I need to get some control here. So I brought it back to visualising what I had been taught from this CD, was to imagine your body, your uterus, is like a rose, and a rosebud, and the petals are opening gradually, and I could bring back the sound of the music that was playing in the background on that CD, of the waves on the shore. And I took myself back to that place, and I got control again.
Okay.
So I realised that actually this is super powerful, because I managed to go back into my own zone and zone out everything else. And I knew that I wanted to learn more about hypnotherapy because it was so powerful.
This was before you became an actual therapist?
Yes.
So you were a hypnotherapist first?
I was a hypnotherapist first,
okay,
yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
With hypnotherapy, the premise is that language can affect your reality.
Oh, yes.
And the very fact that we call it labour
yes.
presupposes that it's going to be hard work.
Yeah.
Right, doesn't it? So it's almost like you're hypnotising yourself beforehand, so you've got to hypnotise yourself out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I've also heard people say okay, even how you choose to describe things. I think it was Tony Robbins, he said, don't say you're mad, say you're peeved. It's got a different effect, hasn't it? I'm mad versus I'm peeved.
Yeah, you can dial that down then, can't you?
Yeah. And then how did that transition the hypnotherapy to doing actual therapy?
I realised actually that although the hypnotherapy was great, I didn't have a framework, and I had a lot of people coming in with problems that I didn't quite know, I didn't quite have the solution for. And I was really interested in the Human Givens framework, this idea that we have emotional needs. And I'd been reading the book, and so I decided to take the plunge and do their qualification, and I'm really pleased that I did. I didn't look back after that. And so I've rolled in the hypnotherapy with the psychotherapy. Although Human Givens does like guided imagery, they do use that as part of their therapy anyway.
With the guided imagery, can you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so guided imagery, to my mind, is a nice way of saying hypnosis. It's a less scary way of saying hypnotherapy, because there's a lot of people that don't understand what hypnotherapy is. So guided imagery, hypnotherapy are really one and the same. We all go in and out of hypnotic states all the time. We don't, unless you probably don't even realise that when you're driving your car, you don't remember every second of driving your car. So your mind is focused perhaps on what you're going to have for dinner or a conversation that you once had, and your subconscious mind is quite happily driving your car. So you're actually in a state of trance. As terrifying as it sounds, that's the truth of it. So, and we can go in and out of this state at will, which is a great tool to use. And, you know, if you are able to imagine relaxing and dialing down your emotions, or dialing up confidence if you need to, for example, you can really get control of your mind that way. And it's accessing the state of sleep, which is the theta brain state, which is similar to when you fall asleep. Okay. It's a dreamlike state, okay? And the therapist, a trained hypnotherapist, can guide you through and deliver post-hypnotic suggestions while you're in that state, to guide you through the imagery that you want, the positive imagery. So it could be imagining yourself in the future. So if you had, for example, anxiety over dogs, and you wanted to imagine that you were calmer, you would have post-hypnotic suggestions delivered that you, when you see a dog in the street, you're going to, rather than freeze or run, you're going to feel yourself really calming right back down again and walking taller, speaking more confidently, or whatever the scenario is that you want to do, like going into a presentation or something like that.
In that example, it's like you're progressively desensitizing yourself without the actual stimulus being there, right?
Yes, but if you imagine, it's like creating new neural pathways. Okay. So it's called future pacing, and it's something that we do in NLP as well. So okay. I always roll in hypnotherapy with NLP because they're very powerful together. And so if you imagine, you know, when we learn anything, we always create a new pathway in our minds. But of course, if it's something that you want to have more confidence with, if you can just imagine being more confident, you will actually create those pathways without actually going out and really doing it for real. So your brain, in a sense, doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's imagined.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard that. Studies done on bodybuilders, where they got some bodybuilders that actually train, and then some bodybuilders just imagine.
Yes.
And they still had the same similar amounts of gain on their muscle, even though one group didn't actually do any of the exercise. I'm like, okay, don't need my gym membership anymore.
I know. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It really is.
Another thing I found interesting is about the whole visualization aspect is to say imagination is more powerful than the will. So an example is like if you're in a stressful situation, you try and will yourself to calm down, it's not going to happen. But if you just imagine yourself in a different location, you're by the beach, there's calming waves, then that imagery can help relax your body. Some things just can't be forced.
Yes, and that's something that I do with every client, is I always take them to their own personal oasis. Okay. So it's a place either imagined or maybe something they may have seen in a magazine. It could be a nice tropical beach, it could be a mountain, it could be a meadow or a garden, it could be anywhere at all. It could be a place that you go to all the time. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is that you turn up the dials and everything you can see and everything you can hear and feel and smell and taste in those places.
With this whole hypnosis, hypnotherapy, NLP, is there some sort of ethics behind all of it so people don't abuse it?
Yeah, I mean, it can be used for really awful things. I mean, you know, I can imagine in war conflict situations. I mean, I do know they have used it to really brainwash people and mess with people's minds. But the ethics are that we wouldn't try to remove a memory. That would not be ethical to do. Okay. But you can quash it. You can close down that tab, the program that's running. You can file it away in your imaginary filing cabinet somewhere in your mind. So that if you needed to access it, so for example, if you were going through a court case, and I've had this happen quite a lot with clients, let's say they've had a traumatic situation with, a spouse calling the police on them and so on and so forth, and they might need to go to court to sort out access to the children. They wouldn't want to forget the negatives of what happened because they need to be able to present their case to the judge. So in those situations, I've always said, rather than trying to let go of the past now, it's best to wait until the legal side of it is out of the way completely, so that you can present your case with enough emotion that the judge will at least believe you, and then we can deal with letting go of that trauma and putting it away afterwards.
Okay, sure. All right, let's go on to the next thing. So, what is anxiety? This is like one of your specialisms, isn't it?
So anxiety is caused, we can either have generalised anxiety, or it could be anxiety is where you have a perceived threat or something is signalling to you that something needs to change. Okay, so some people will grow up with a certain level of anxiety, and that can come from childhood. It can be a learned behaviour, so you can learn to be anxious from your parents. It can come from a trauma, it can come from something that's happened in the past. And our minds, we're always looking for similarities. So we're pattern matching creatures, okay, the human mind. We're always looking for things that are even remotely similar to the past. And it's almost like we've got a security guard in the mind, okay? Or a guard dog or an alarm or whatever you want to think. But I like the analogy of a security guard. And this security guard is always looking out from the control room of your mind through your own eyes without you realising. And it's always looking for threat and danger. So when you've got someone who has, you may have come across people who have panic attacks, for example, and they can literally come out of nowhere. I don't know if you've ever experienced one yourself, but they can seemingly come out of nowhere, and it's because that security guard in your mind has noticed something that's remotely similar, whether that's a person, an environment that you're in, or something. It can trigger that something to your rational mind, and it will signal to your body that there's a danger. So then you start to get the racing heart, the sweaty palms, and the panic attack. So it's really important that we can learn how to retrain that security guard, okay? Close down any programs that are not working for us, that are not helping us in any way, and retrain that security guard, essentially.
Would this fall mainly under your therapy, or is this more something you deal with in hypnotherapy?
Again, I do really rely on hypnotherapy because this imagery works really well when you are very relaxed. Because when you're anxious, your rational brain cannot function. So the emotional brain literally blocks the rational thinking brain, the higher cortex. The two cannot operate at the same time. So, I mean, if you think about it, for example, it's the limbic system that comes into play. And if you were to walk round the corner and you saw a lion, okay, you're not going to engage your rational brain because it's a lot slower than your emotional brain. Your limbic system is there to keep you safe. You're not going to stand there and say, golly gosh, how did that get there? Okay, you're literally going to either freeze, flee, or if you're brave enough, you might try and fight it. Okay, that's the instinctive reaction that is there to keep us safe.
One thing about that fight or flight response, a lot of the issues now is we may not face a lot of physical dangers in our daily life, but a lot of the fight or flight response is triggered by threats to a person's ego, and that could be triggered by anything, and that causes a lot of the issues we see, like mental issues, because say if you're in the boardroom with your boss, you can't fight or run away from your boss. So in those situations, you still have the fight or flight response running,
Yes.
but you can't actually do the behaviours which will release that tension.
Exactly. And the best thing you need to do when you are feeling like that is to go for a run. That is the best way to extinguish those feelings. Okay. And of course, you can't do that if you're in a boardroom situation. So I would say in those situations, the best thing to do is to go in prepared and to have learnt how to dial down those emotions on demand. So again, it's thinking about your control room in your mind, where that security guard sits. It's training your security guard. It's updating the files on how you want to behave, how you want to respond, and finding the dials or the levers on those particular emotions and practicing dialing them up as well as dialing them down, and really noticing the response you get in your body. Okay. So that when you can go into that scenario, and again, you know, with the, like I said, the future pacing, if you imagine, if you've got something like that coming up, if you go into your mind and just fantasize about it going really well, and about you seeing everybody's faces and noticing that they look like they like you, and, you know, noticing how you might stand, you might have your head tall and you would speak calmly and you would project your voice really well. And again, so you're creating that neural pathway. So then you've got your dials in your control room, you've got your neural pathway which you've created for success. And also, if you have relaxed and you've practiced being in a personal oasis of calm, you can create something called a pinch anchor, like this, okay? So that you can at any time do this. Quite, you know, no one needs to know you're doing it, and you can instantly access those feelings of confidence and calm again. Okay, so when you say pinch anchor, so are you associating that feeling of calm to a physical action? Yeah. So what I always do with clients is when they are in their personal oasis, okay, and they're at their peak of relaxation, I ask them to pinch together their finger and thumb on their dominant hand, so they're anchoring themselves with that feeling and being there. So they can at any time access that feeling, and they can any time pinch together the finger and thumb, and they will instantly feel like they're there in that place again.
Something related to that, I guess, is self-fulfilling prophecies. So if you create the expectation beforehand, then it's more likely to become reality. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah. It's just, you know, it's almost like your inner compass, or where are you, your inner GPS. Where are you setting your destination? Okay, because if you're in an aeroplane and you need to know your destination, okay, you can make slight adjustments as you go, and you may need to keep adjusting, or you could end up in a completely different country. A bit of wind blows and you've ended up in a different continent. But, you know, you can actually, as long as you're aware of where it is you want to go, and you set that intention in your mind, then you're much more likely to get there in the way that you want to get there.
Okay, so next thing I want to go into is the 9 emotional needs. So this is something from your Human Givens training, isn't it?
It is, and it's a really useful framework for any therapist, I would say, and it's really helped me with the therapy that I offer. So we all have emotional needs, a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we have the basics of needing security and heat and food. This is another layer of emotional needs. And if we don't get our needs met emotionally in balance, we can end up with things like anxiety, depression, and even addiction. So it's really important that we do a mini life audit and look at which of these needs are being met or not met in balance. And this comes heavily into my divorce coaching as well. So well, you look at anyone who's going through divorce, it's quite obvious that you're going to feel perhaps a loss of control, to some less secure in some sense, and that's one of the emotional needs. You may, for example, lose the roof over your head, or feel like you're not going to see the children anymore, and that's that massive insecurity for a lot of people, and finances as well. And also another one of the needs is attention. And so you might find that when you're going through a divorce or any kind of situation, you might not have the support network around you that you perhaps once had. So, for example, if you had your in-laws and that whole extended family is suddenly gone, you could find yourself feeling very alone. One of the really important emotional needs, and one of the ones that most of us don't manage to have, is feeling a sense of being connected to a wider community. And that's a really tricky one. And I think unless you've got a good hobby where you're meeting lots of people and you really feel like you're part of something, or if you're in a religion and perhaps you attend church, this is one of the emotional needs that most people really struggle with.
Yeah, I think that's a malaise in modern culture.
Yeah.
Have you heard of a chap called Bastian Junger?
Oh, no.
He wrote a book called Tribe. He was telling a story about how a lot of people who got captured by Indians, integrated into the tribe, they would get rescued and they would escape to rejoin the Indian tribe because of the sense of like connectedness with the tribe.
Yeah.
Another thing, in wartime, there were these patients who were catatonic, they couldn't even get up, or there were people in mental hospitals, and in the Blitz, they suddenly needed ambulance drivers, and they got up and just started driving the ambulances. Because suddenly they felt like they were part of something, part of the tribe. They had high calling and stuff.
And they had purpose.
Yeah, they had purpose as well, meaning.
Yes, and that's another one of the emotional needs.
Purpose,
is purpose, having a sense of purpose and that life is actually meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's a biggie for a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah. I think in relation to men, I think that's quite a big one. A lot of men go through like a extended adolescence. They're living at home with their parents for longer. They are taking longer to mature, spending a lot of time in video games, escaping life. And I think a lot of that is really down to lack of purpose. A lot of cultures in the past, they would have like initiation rituals, and that would take a boy to manhood. And we don't have that in modern culture. So there's no point at which you can say, okay, now I'm a man, other than the fact that you're fully grown. Yes. But psychologically, you could still be quite boyish, no responsibility, no sense of purpose.
Yeah. So purpose and also achieving things. So if you don't have purpose, you're probably not going to be achieving much. And achievement is another one of the emotional needs. Because
if you don't have purpose, you don't have a standard by which you can judge the achievement. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I suppose the example you gave with if somebody's gaming all day, I mean, maybe that's their sense of purpose. Maybe, and they would be achieving things if they're gaming. Perhaps they would see that as an achievement. But if they're not out at work, they're not climbing the career ladder, they're not making money, I suppose then you could say that they're not achieving things.
The thing with video games is it's designed to put you in a state of flow, so you constantly want to pursue the game. And the reason behind it is there's always a level to chase, and it's just within your reach. So it keeps you in that state where you just want to keep pursuing it. But at the same time, how much is that like an intrinsic sense of purpose versus that you're just addicted to the video game?
Yeah.
Because it's got you hooked.
Yeah. And when you're in that state, you're not connecting with other people. You might be in the sense that you're gaming with other people online in a virtual sense. But connection with real people in the real world is another really important emotional need.
Okay, so talk to me about the other needs on the list. So there's 9 in total, isn't there? So
did I mention security?
So security in relation to
divorce,
relation to divorce, you might lose the children, financial security. Yeah.
Yes, giving and receiving attention. Feeling in control of your life. And again, if you're going through a divorce, you're really not going to feel that in control of the situation because you can't control other people. You can only control yourself. So, if you've got a particularly acrimonious divorce, sometimes people really don't know from one day or week to the next what their life's going to be like or what they're going to have to fight about next.
Does this sort of feed into your locus of control? Because some people have more of an internal locus of control, some people have more of an external locus of control.
Yes, absolutely.
If you've got someone who's got a really high external locus of control, how can you help them? because they almost need like everything in their life to line up before they're going to feel secure, right? Because everything's external to them.
But we don't ever really have control of things outside of us. We only really have control of ourselves and what's going on inside of ourselves.
So in that situation, you would get them to shift to having a more internal locus of control. So
because
shifting perception. Yeah.
That's true control.
Okay.
You can't control anything outside of yourself.
Sure.
That's the reality.
Yeah. What else is on the list?
One not to forget is privacy. It's really important that a person can have time to take away and reflect.
Okay.
On anything, on how their life is going, or conversations, just time alone so that you can just be you.
Okay, next thing I want to go into is that the third component of what you do is divorce coaching. Yeah?
Yes, yeah.
And in particular, the 4 keys to surviving.
Yes, okay. So
I've got a song in my mind now. I'm a survivor.
So if I just briefly tell you what divorce coaching is, because
Sure.
It's perhaps something that's not many people have heard of. It's relatively new. Divorce coaching is essentially holding somebody's hand through the divorce process and helping them to cope emotionally with what's going on, and to help them to find solutions going forward. Now, as I said, coaching isn't really about trauma of the past, and this is where it can get a little bit messy. But thankfully, because I have already got qualifications in helping people with trauma, we can do a little bit of first aid and help people with that first. And then moving forward with the divorce coaching, it's essentially filling in the gaps between seeing your solicitor or maybe speaking to your financial advisor, and it's signposting you to the right people to create a support network that you're going to need to get you through the process. And of course, there's always going to be things that you won't want to speak to a legal professional about, little questions, perhaps about the process, that you don't want to spend £200 just to ask a solicitor. It is something that perhaps you just need to speak to a divorce coach about. And
the unique thing for you as well, because coaching comes after therapy. So because you have that therapy background, you can offer the full package rather than refer someone if they're not ready for coaching.
Exactly. Right? So I have all those tools in my toolkit to help people. So thankfully I do have that.
Yeah.
But with the divorce coaching process, there are essentially 4 keys to success. So the very first thing a person should do is really learn to take responsibility, okay? Because there's no one is going to look after you but you, okay? So it's really realising that you have to stand on your own 2 feet and make your own decisions, which perhaps, if you were a housewife for 20 years, you probably let your husband do all the finances and make all the decisions. Well, that's something that needs to change. So you have to really take responsibility. That's the very first thing to realise. The second thing is to realise that you have to have clarity, because knowledge is power, okay? And even if you don't like what you learn and it feels uncomfortable, overall it is going to reduce the stress, okay? So it's important to get knowledge and get clarity. And once you've done that, then moving on to the third key, which is you can begin to take back control, not only of your own emotional state, but also of the actual divorce process itself. So when your spouse is coming to you and throwing at you their needs and their desires, you'll know exactly what your rights are and what you need as well. Okay. And then the fourth key is focusing on moving forward positively. And this is creating small stepping stones that you can take. You have to understand, with any goal, you have to know how you're going to get there. And so if you break it down into small steps, it's like climbing a mountain, okay? If you're looking up at the top of the mountain, it's going to seem insurmountable. But if you just keep chipping away and you plot a vague route, and you take small steps each and every day, even if it's just a text or quickly looking something up that's going to get you to your destination, you're going to look up and realise that you're almost at the summit. Okay. So they're essentially the 4 keys to divorce coaching.
It sounds like it's very much about agency.
Yes.
Giving a person their agency back.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Rita, so thank you for doing this podcast with me today.
Very welcome. Yes, I've enjoyed it.
It's been very interesting. How can people get in touch with you?
So yeah, you can find me online at my website, www.clarity-matters.co.uk, or you can find me on Instagram or Facebook.
What's your Instagram, IG?
I don't know. Actually, I don't know. It might be Clarity Matters, I don't know.
Okay. We'll cut that.
Yeah.
So I'll post your website link and your Facebook and Instagram on the bottom of the podcast video. And thank you very much for doing the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.